Jack Morrison watched the rare spotted foal freeze in terror as two giant stallions reared up above it, their hooves seconds away from crushing its fragile skull into the desert sand. The homeless veteran had nothing left to lose except his life, and somehow that made running straight into the battle the easiest decision he'd made in years. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The desert wind carried dust across the abandoned ranch like whispers of forgotten dreams. Jack Morrison had seen many things in his 53 years, most of them in places he'd rather forget, but nothing had prepared him for what he was about to witness on this scorching afternoon in the Nevada wilderness. He'd been walking for hours, his worn combat boots kicking up small clouds of dust with each step, his backpack containing everything he owned in this world, pressing against shoulders that had once carried the weight of military gear through hostile territories halfway around the globe. Now those same shoulders carried only the burden of survival and the invisible scars of a war that never really ended, even when you came home. Jack had been living rough for the past 2 years, ever since the foreclosure notice arrived at the small apartment he could no longer afford. The VA checks weren't enough, and the jobs he'd tried to hold down never lasted long. The nightmares saw to that. The sudden sounds that made him hit the floor, the flashbacks that transported him back to dusty roads where any moment could be your last. So he'd taken to the open spaces, the quiet places where the only explosions were thunderstorms and the only enemies were hunger and cold. He'd learned to survive out here just as he'd learned to survive in the desert sands of another continent. The skills came back easier than he'd expected, finding water, reading the land, moving quietly, staying invisible. Today he'd been following an old cattle trail that wound through the scrubland, hoping it might lead to one of the springs marked on the tattered map he'd salvaged from a gas station dumpster. The sun was merciless, beating down from a sky bleached almost white by the heat, and his water bottle was getting dangerously light. He'd need to find that spring soon, or the next few days were going to be very difficult. But it wasn't the thought of water that made him stop suddenly in his tracks. It was the sound. At first he thought it was thunder, but the sky was cloudless. Then he recognized it, a sound he'd heard before in documentaries and old westerns, but never in real life. The thundering of hooves, multiple horses running hard. He turned toward the sound, shading his eyes against the brutal sun, and saw them emerging from a canyon to his left. 2 massive stallions, one a pale gray that seemed to glow in the sunlight, the other a deep bay so dark it was almost black. They were magnificent, wild, and clearly engaged in some kind of territorial dispute. Jack had read about the wild horses that still roamed parts of Nevada, descendants of Spanish Mustangs and escaped ranch horses that had adapted to the harsh desert environment. These 2 were clearly leaders of their respective herds, and they were heading straight toward each other with the kind of intensity that spoke of something more than a casual disagreement. This was serious. This was primal. This was about dominance, about territory, about the ancient law that governed the wild places where humans were just passing shadows. The stallions met with a collision that Jack felt in his chest even from 100 yards away. They reared up, towering against the sky like mythological creatures, their hooves flashing in the sunlight as they struck at each other. The gray had a slight advantage in height, but the bay was broader, more muscular. They screamed challenges that echoed off the canyon walls, sounds that raised the hair on the back of Jack's neck despite all the truly terrifying things he'd heard in his life. There was something pure about this violence, something honest. These weren't humans fighting over ideologies or resources they didn't need. These were wild animals fighting for the most basic of reasons, for the right to exist in this place, to lead their families, to pass on their bloodlines. Jack should have moved on. This wasn't his fight. He'd learned long ago not to get involved in things that didn't concern him. Every time he'd tried to help someone, to stand up for what was right, it had ended badly. The homeless shelter where he'd stopped a fight and ended up banned for violence. The construction site where he'd reported safety violations and lost his job. The world didn't want heroes anymore if it ever had. It wanted people who kept their heads down and minded their own business. He'd learned that lesson the hard way, over and over again, but then he saw it. Between the two fighting giants, almost invisible in the dust and chaos, was a small shape. At first, Jack thought it was just a rock or a piece of brush, but then it moved. His heart lurched. It was a foal. Not just any foal, but one with a coat pattern he'd never seen before, a mixture of spotted and solid coloring that seemed to shift in the dust-filled air. The little one couldn't have been more than a few weeks old, and it was directly in the path of the battling stallions. Every time they reared and came down, their hooves struck the ground dangerously close to the small creature. The foal was frozen, either too scared to move or too young to understand the danger. Jack's military training kicked in before his brain could catch up. He was already moving, dropping his backpack and running toward the fight. Years of staying invisible, of avoiding trouble, of keeping to himself, all of it evaporated in an instant. Some instincts run deeper than self-preservation. Some things matter more than safety. He'd failed to save too many people in his life, in the war and after. He wasn't going to stand by and watch an innocent creature die, not if there was something, anything, he could do to prevent it. The distance between Jack and the fighting stallions closed faster than he'd expected. His legs, strengthened by months of walking across rough terrain, carried him forward with a speed that surprised even him. The years melted away, and for a moment he wasn't a homeless veteran struggling to survive. He was a soldier again, moving with purpose, driven by a mission that made sense in a way nothing had made sense for a very long time. The dust kicked up by the horse's hooves stung his eyes and filled his lungs, but he didn't slow down. He couldn't. Every second mattered. The stallions were so focused on each other that they didn't notice him at first. They circled and struck, their massive bodies colliding with sounds like thunder, their screams of rage echoing across the desert. The gray stallion had teeth bared, trying to get a hold on the bay's neck, while the bay used his superior weight to try to force the gray back. They were equally matched, which meant this fight could go on for a long time, long enough for that foal to get crushed beneath their hooves. Jack could see the little one more clearly now, trembling but unable to move, its spotted coat dusty and its eyes wide with terror. Jack didn't think. He just acted. He ran straight into the space between the two giants, waving his arms and shouting at the top of his lungs. It was the kind of crazy, suicidal move that would have gotten him court-martialed in the military, but out here there were no rules except survival. The stallions, shocked by the sudden appearance of a human in their battle zone, broke apart. The gray reared back, his front hooves pawing the air just inches from Jack's head. The bay wheeled to the side, snorting with confusion and anger. For a split second, all three of them, the two horses and the man, were frozen in a triangle of mutual surprise. That split second was all Jack needed. He dove for the foal, wrapping his arms around its small body and rolling to the side just as the bay stallion's hooves came down where they had both been standing a heartbeat before. The impact sent up a spray of dust and small rocks. Jack felt one strike his shoulder but ignored the pain. He had the foal. That was all that mattered. The little creature was lighter than he'd expected, all legs and fragile bones, but it was fighting him now, terrified and trying to escape from this new threat. Jack held on, protecting the foal's head with one arm while he scrambled to his feet. The stallions, their attention now divided between their fight and this strange intruder who had dared to interfere, circled uncertainly. The gray took a step toward Jack, head lowered, clearly considering whether to charge this human who had stolen something from the battlefield. Jack knew he had only seconds to get out of there before one or both of the stallions decided he was a bigger threat than each other. He backed away slowly, keeping his body between the foal and the horses, making himself as big as possible without making any sudden movements. It was a delicate balance, showing he wasn't prey, but also not challenging them directly. The bay stallion screamed again, a sound of pure frustration, and pawed the ground. Dust flew up around his hooves. He wanted to charge. Jack could see it in every line of the horse's body, but something held him back. Maybe it was the confusion of having a human appear out of nowhere. Maybe it was the instinct that told him this strange, two-legged creature wasn't worth abandoning his fight with his real enemy. Whatever the reason, the bay turned back to the gray, and within seconds they were engaged again, their battle resuming as if Jack and the foal had never been there. Jack didn't wait to see how the fight would end. He turned and ran, cradling the struggling foal against his chest, heading back toward where he'd dropped his backpack. His lungs burned and his heart hammered, but he didn't stop until he was well away from the fighting stallions. Only when he reached a cluster of rocks that offered some shelter did he finally slow down and catch his breath. He set the foal down gently, keeping one hand on its neck to prevent it from bolting back toward the danger. Now that he had a chance to really look at it, Jack was struck by how unique the little horse was. Its coat was a patchwork of white and brown spots, but not in the regular pattern of an Appaloosa. This was something different, something he'd never seen before. The markings seemed almost random, as if someone had splattered paint across a canvas. The foal's legs were long and gangly, typical of a newborn, and its eyes were the color of dark honey. Despite its fear, there was something in those eyes that reminded Jack of himself, a kind of stubborn will to survive against the odds. The foal stopped struggling and stood trembling, its sides heaving with rapid breaths. It looked at Jack with those honey-colored eyes, and something passed between them, an understanding perhaps, or just a moment of shared trauma. Jack kept his hand on the foal's neck, feeling the rapid heartbeat gradually slow down. He spoke softly, words that didn't really matter, just sounds meant to calm and reassure. It was what his squad leader had done for him once after a particularly bad firefight, talking to him in a low, steady voice until the shaking stopped and the world came back into focus. Where had this foal come from? Jack looked around, scanning the landscape for any sign of a herd, but saw nothing except the dust cloud from the fighting stallions, still visible in the distance. The foal was alone, just like him, separated from its family, vulnerable and dependent on the kindness of strangers in a world that rarely offered kindness to anyone. Jack knew he should leave the foal here and move on. That was the smart thing to do, the practical thing. He had enough trouble taking care of himself without adding a baby horse to his responsibilities. He had no money, no home, no resources. What could he possibly offer this creature? And yet, as he looked into those honey-colored eyes, he knew he couldn't walk away. Something about this moment felt important, like a test he hadn't known he was taking. Maybe it was his last chance to prove to himself that he was still human, still capable of caring about something other than his own survival. The sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. Jack retrieved his backpack and took stock of his situation. He had about a quarter bottle of water left, some beef jerky, a can of beans, and not much else. The spring he'd been looking for was still somewhere ahead, assuming his map was accurate and it hadn't dried up. He needed to find it before dark, for his sake, and now for the foal's sake too. Baby horses needed water, probably more than he did. He'd seen military working dogs in the desert, knew how quickly dehydration could kill, and figured it couldn't be that different for horses. The foal had calmed down somewhat, but was clearly distressed. It kept looking around, probably searching for its mother, and let out small whinnies that broke Jack's heart. He'd heard those kinds of sounds before, the cries of children separated from their parents in war zones, the desperate calls of the lost and frightened. He'd never gotten used to those sounds, They haunted his dreams along with all the other things he couldn't forget. He reached out slowly and touched the foal's neck again, stroking gently. The little horse flinched but didn't pull away. Jack made a decision. He would take the foal with him to find the spring. After that, well, he'd figure it out. Maybe he could find the herd it belonged to. Maybe someone at the next town would know what to do. Maybe this was all a terrible idea that would end badly for both of them. But standing here doing nothing wasn't an option. He'd spent too much of his life paralyzed by indecision, frozen by the fear of making the wrong choice. This time he would act, and whatever happened would happen. The problem was getting the foal to move. It didn't trust him, and why should it? Jack was a stranger who had grabbed it out of nowhere during the most terrifying experience of its short life. He tried walking a few steps, calling to it softly, but the foal just stood there trembling. Jack remembered something he'd read once, or maybe seen on television before his life fell apart. Something about how horses were herd animals, how they followed each other. If he could get the foal to see him as part of its herd, maybe it would follow. Jack knelt down, making himself smaller and less threatening. He spoke in a low, steady voice, the same tone he'd used to calm frightened civilians, to talk down soldiers on the edge of breaking. He told the foal about the spring they were going to find, about the cool water that was waiting for them, about how everything was going to be okay, even though he had no idea if that was true. He told the foal about a horse he'd known as a kid, back when his family still had the farm, back before everything went wrong. An old mare named Rosie who had let him ride her bareback through the fields, who had been his best friend during the worst years of his childhood. Talking about Rosie hurt. Jack hadn't thought about her in years, hadn't let himself think about those days because remembering what he'd lost was too painful. But now the memories came flooding back. The smell of hay and leather, the feeling of Rosie's mane between his fingers, the sense of freedom he'd felt galloping across open fields with nothing but sky above and earth below. Those had been the good days, before his father's drinking got worse, before the farm was sold, before Jack ran away to join the military thinking he could escape his past. The foal took a tentative step toward him, then another. Jack kept talking, kept his voice low and calm, kept his body language non-threatening. The foal came close enough that he could feel its breath on his hands. Slowly, carefully, Jack stood up. The foal didn't bolt. That was progress. Jack took a step toward the direction he needed to go, and miracle of miracles, the foal followed. Another step. The foal followed again. Jack felt something loosen in his chest, a tension he'd been carrying so long he'd forgotten it was there. They walked together through the desert, man and horse, both of them refugees from violence, both of them looking for water and safety and something they couldn't quite name. The landscape around them was harsh and beautiful, all red rocks and twisted juniper trees and endless sky. Jack had learned to appreciate this kind of beauty during his time living rough. When you had nothing else, you had the world around you, and if you paid attention, it could fill some of the empty places inside. The foal stayed close to Jack, sometimes so close it bumped against his leg. He could feel its warmth through his jeans, could hear its breathing and the soft sounds it made. It was strange how quickly he'd become responsible for this creature, how natural it felt to have it walking beside him. He'd been alone for so long that he'd forgotten what it was like to have a companion, to have someone depending on him for something other than his ability to hurt people. In the military, people had depended on him to be a weapon, to be good at killing. Out here on the streets, people had depended on him to stay away, to not be a problem. But this foal depended on him to be something different, to be kind, to be gentle, to be the person he'd once hoped he might become. The shadows grew longer as they walked, stretching across the desert floor like dark fingers reaching for the horizon. Jack kept checking his map, trying to match the terrain features he could see with the faded markings on the crumpled paper. According to what he could decipher, the spring should be just beyond a ridge that rose up ahead of them, marked by a distinctive rock formation that looked like a giant's tooth against the sky. He'd been aiming for it all day, and now, with the foal beside him, reaching it felt more urgent than ever. The foal was starting to lag, its steps becoming slower and more uncertain. Jack could see the exhaustion in the way it held its head, the trembling in its legs. It was too young for this kind of journey, too small to be wandering the desert without its mother. Guilt gnawed at Jack's conscience. Maybe he should have left it where it was. Maybe its mother would have come back for it. Maybe he just made everything worse the way he always seemed to make things worse when he tried to help. But no, he told himself firmly. That foal would have died under those stallions' hooves. Whatever happened now, at least he'd given it a chance. Jack stopped and pulled out his water bottle. There wasn't much left, maybe 3 swallows worth, but the foal needed it more than he did. He'd survived longer without water before. In the desert overseas, he'd learned to push his body to its limits, to function on minimal resources. But the foal was just a baby. Jack knelt down and cupped his hand, pouring a little water into his palm. The foal sniffed it suspiciously at first, then its pink tongue darted out and lapped up the water eagerly. Jack poured more, letting the precious liquid pool in his hand until the bottle was empty. The foal drank it all, and when it was done, it looked at him with those honey-colored eyes, as if seeing him for the first time as something other than a threat. "You're welcome, little one," Jack said softly. He stood up, his knees protesting the movement. He wasn't as young as he used to be, and living rough had taken its toll on his body. But he pushed the discomfort aside and kept moving. The spring was close now, it had to be. It had. The alternative, that his map was wrong or the spring had dried up, was too terrible to contemplate. They walked on, the foal matching his pace, and Jack found himself talking to it again. It was easier than talking to people. The foal didn't judge, didn't ask questions he couldn't answer, didn't look at him with pity or disgust or fear. He told the foal about the war, things he'd never told anyone, about the friends he'd lost, the mistakes he'd made, the things he'd done that he could never undo, about the young translator who'd trusted him and died because Jack made the wrong call, about the village they'd been ordered to secure, and the children's faces he still saw in his nightmares, about coming home to a country that said it honored veterans but looked right through them on the streets, about the slow descent from soldier to civilian to homeless man living in the margins of society. The foal listened with its ears swiveling, and Jack imagined it understood, even though he knew that was foolish. But it felt good to say the words out loud, to release some of the poison he'd been carrying inside. As they crested the ridge, Jack's heart lifted. There, in a small canyon below, was a glint of water. The spring. It was real. It existed. They were going to be okay, at least for tonight. He felt tears prick his eyes and blinked them away angrily. He'd learned not to cry because once you started, it was hard to stop, and out here you couldn't afford that kind of weakness. But the relief was overwhelming. He hadn't failed. He'd brought them both to safety. The descent was tricky, loose rocks and steep slopes that made Jack's boots slide with each step. The foal struggled too, its long legs not quite coordinated enough for this kind of terrain. Twice it stumbled and Jack caught it, steadying the small body with his hands, feeling the rapid heartbeat under the soft coat. They helped each other down, man and horse, both of them clumsy and tired but determined. When they finally reached the bottom and stood at the edge of the spring, Jack could have wept with gratitude. The water was clear and cold, bubbling up from somewhere deep in the earth and collecting in a natural basin before trickling away into the sand. Desert plants grew thick around the edges, fed by the reliable moisture. It was an oasis, a miracle in the middle of nowhere. Jack knelt and drank deeply, cupping water to his mouth over and over until his stomach felt uncomfortably full. The foal waded right in, splashing and drinking with the unself-conscious enthusiasm of the young. Water sprayed everywhere, and Jack found himself laughing. An actual genuine laugh, something he hadn't done in longer than he could remember. They stayed by the spring as darkness fell, Jack setting up his small camp in the shelter of some rocks, while the foal grazed on the green plants growing nearby. Jack had a tiny camping stove and used it to heat his can of beans, eating them slowly while watching the stars emerge one by one in the vast desert sky. The foal came and lay down near him, folding its long legs beneath its body. Jack reached out and rested his hand on its neck, feeling the warmth and the steady breathing. This was peace, he realized. This moment right here was what peace felt like. No noise, no chaos, no fear. Just the quiet desert night, the sound of water trickling, and a small living creature trusting him enough to sleep beside him. Jack woke before dawn, his internal clock still set to military time even after all these years. The foal was pressed against his side, using him as a windbreak against the cold desert night. He lay still for a moment, not wanting to disturb it, watching the sky lighten from black to deep purple to orange. He'd slept better than he had in months, deeply and without nightmares, and he suspected it had something to do with the warm presence beside him. Having something to protect, someone to care for, gave him a purpose that had been missing from his life for too long. When the foal finally stirred and stood up, stretching its long legs and shaking its spotted coat, Jack set about the task of figuring out what to do next. He couldn't stay here forever, as much as he might want to. The spring was perfect, but it was too isolated. The foal needed more than water and wild plants. It needed proper food, probably medical care to make sure it was healthy after its traumatic separation from its mother. And if Jack was being honest with himself, he needed those things too. He'd been running from civilization for 2 years, but maybe it was time to stop running. The nearest town was 30 miles east, a small place called Silver Ridge that he'd passed through once before. It had a gas station, a diner, and not much else, but where there was a town, there might be someone who knew about horses, maybe a rancher who could take the foal, give it a proper home. The thought of giving it up made Jack's chest tighten, but he pushed the feeling aside. This wasn't about what he wanted. He had no right to keep a wild horse, no ability to care for it long term. The responsible thing was to find it a home with people who had the resources to raise it properly. Before they left the spring, Jack refilled his water bottle and washed as best he could in the cold water. The foal drank deeply and then followed him as he started walking east toward the rising sun. They fell into an easy rhythm, the foal sometimes trotting ahead and then circling back, sometimes walking right beside him with its shoulder brushing his leg. Jack found himself watching it constantly, amazed by its resilience. Less than 24 hours ago, it had nearly been trampled to death, and now here it was, curious and playful, investigating every interesting rock and plant. The sun climbed higher, and the temperature rose. Jack was grateful he'd filled his water bottle because the landscape between the spring and Silver Ridge was harsh and dry. They walked for hours, stopping frequently to rest in whatever shade they could find. Jack shared his water with the foal, rationing it carefully but always making sure the little horse got enough. His own thirst he could manage, but watching the foal suffer was something he couldn't bear. Around midday, as they rested under a scraggly mesquite tree, Jack noticed something odd about the foal's behavior. It kept looking back the way they'd come, its ears pricked forward, making small, anxious sounds. At first, Jack thought maybe it was missing its herd, but then he heard it too. Hoofbeats, multiple horses, moving fast. He stood up quickly, his hand instinctively going to his belt where he used to carry a sidearm, but he had no weapon now except a small pocket knife, useless against anything bigger than a rabbit. The horses appeared over a rise, and Jack's heart sank. It was a group of wild mustangs, maybe a dozen of them, and leading them was a massive bay stallion that Jack recognized immediately. It was one of the fighters from yesterday, the dark one with the powerful build, and he was heading straight toward them. Jack realized with a cold clarity what must have happened. This was the foal's herd, and the bay was probably its father. The stallion had either won the fight or abandoned it to search for his missing offspring, and now he'd found it, with a strange human standing between him and his baby. Jack knew he should step away, let the stallion take the foal back to its family. That was the natural order of things, the way it was supposed to be, but something in him rebelled against the idea. He'd saved this foal, cared for it, kept it alive through the night. He'd bonded with it in a way he couldn't fully explain. And more than that, he wasn't convinced the stallion would be gentle. Wild stallions were known to be aggressive, especially toward foals that weren't their own. What if this one rejected the spotted baby? What if it hurt it? The foal, seeing its herd, let out a loud whinny and started toward them. Jack grabbed it gently, holding it back, and the stallion screamed in response. It was a sound of pure rage, a challenge, and a threat. The other horses in the herd scattered slightly, nervous, while the stallion charged forward. Jack had seconds to make a decision. Run and take the foal with him, stand his ground, let the foal go. His mind raced through the options, each one seeming worse than the last. He chose to stand. It wasn't rational, wasn't smart, but Jack was tired of running from everything. He stepped in front of the foal, making himself as big as possible, and raised his arms. The stallion was enormous up close, easily 16 hands high, all muscle and fury and wild beauty. It came to a sliding stop just feet away, rearing up and striking the air with its hooves. Jack didn't flinch. He'd faced down enemy combatants, suicide bombers, insurgents with automatic weapons. A horse, no matter how big, was something he could handle. The stallion came down hard, his hooves hitting the ground with impacts that Jack felt through his boots. Dust exploded upward in clouds that caught the harsh sunlight. The horse's eyes were wild, rolling white at the edges, nostrils flared wide as he took in Jack's scent and assessed this threat to his herd. Behind the stallion, the other horses milled nervously, mares with foals of their own, younger horses that kept their distance from the drama unfolding before them. Jack could see their uncertainty, the way they looked between their leader and this strange human who dared to stand against him. Jack held his ground, keeping his body language firm but not aggressive. He'd learned in the military that dominance was about confidence, not violence, about showing you weren't afraid even when terror was crawling up your spine. The stallion snorted and pawed the ground, tossing his magnificent head. Up close, Jack could see the scars on his hide, marks from countless battles with other stallions, from harsh desert thorns, from the brutal life of a wild horse in unforgiving country. This was not a creature that backed down easily. This was a survivor, a fighter, a leader who had earned his position through strength and determination. The foal behind Jack whinnied again, a sound that was part greeting, part confusion. It wanted to go to the herd, to its family, and Jack understood that. But he also saw something in the stallion's eyes that made him hesitate. There was aggression there, yes, but also something else: suspicion. The way the stallion looked at the spotted foal was not with recognition, but with wariness. Jack's gut told him what his mind didn't want to accept. This stallion didn't recognize the foal as his own. The unusual coloring, so different from any of the other horses in the herd, marked it as an outsider. Wild stallions were known to kill foals that weren't their own. Jack had read about it somewhere back when he still had access to libraries and internet. It was a brutal fact of nature, a way to ensure only the stallion's own bloodline continued. If this foal had been sired by a different stallion, perhaps the gray that had been fighting the bay yesterday, then it was in serious danger. The spots that made it so beautiful to Jack's eyes might be its death sentence in the wild. The stallion took a step forward, still focused on Jack but clearly trying to get to the foal. Jack shifted to block him, and the horse screamed in fury. It was a primal sound, full of rage and frustration, and it made every nerve in Jack's body scream at him to run. But he didn't. He couldn't. He'd already lost too much in his life, failed too many people. He wasn't going to fail this foal. The stallion reared again, higher this time, his hooves flashing dangerously close to Jack's head. Jack could see the underside of the massive animal, the powerful chest, the iron-hard hooves that could crush his skull with a single blow. Time seemed to slow down. Jack could hear his own heartbeat, could feel the adrenaline flooding his system, the old combat instincts taking over. He'd been here before, in this place between life and death, where split-second decisions determined who lived and who didn't. He'd always thought he would die in combat, had made his peace with it during his deployments. But if he was going to die now, at least it would be for something that mattered. At least it would be protecting something innocent, instead of destroying things. The stallion came down and Jack threw himself to the side, rolling in the dirt and coming up in a crouch. The foal had backed away from the confrontation, pressed against a large rock, eyes wide with terror. The stallion advanced on it, and Jack did the only thing he could think of. He ran at the huge horse from the side, yelling at the top of his lungs, waving his arms like a madman. It was insane, suicidal, but it worked. The stallion, surprised by this renewed attack from the crazy human, turned away from the foal and focused back on Jack. They faced each other again, man and beast, in a standoff that couldn't last. Jack was breathing hard, his shirt soaked with sweat, his legs trembling with exhaustion and fear. The stallion was barely winded, muscles rippling under his dark coat, ready to fight for as long as it took. The other horses in the herd watched with what Jack imagined was the equine equivalent of shock. They'd probably never seen anything like this, a human defending a foal against their leader. Then something unexpected happened. One of the mares, a smaller bay with a white star on her forehead, separated from the herd and approached. She moved slowly, carefully, making soft sounds in her throat. She walked past the stallion, who watched her but didn't interfere, and went straight to the spotted foal. She sniffed it carefully, touching her nose to its neck, and the foal responded immediately, pressing against her side. The mare nickered softly and began to groom the foal with gentle nips, cleaning its coat with maternal care. Jack watched in amazement. The mare was accepting the foal, claiming it as her own. Maybe she'd lost a foal of her own and needed something to care for. Maybe she was just a kind-hearted creature in a world that didn't reward kindness. Whatever her reason, she was offering the spotted baby a place in the herd, protection and belonging. The stallion, seeing one of his mares accept the foal, seemed to relax slightly. He was still watching Jack with suspicion, still ready to charge if the human made any threatening moves, but the immediate danger had passed. Jack took a slow step backward, then another, giving the horses space. His hands were shaking now that the adrenaline was wearing off, and his legs felt like water. He'd just faced down a wild stallion and somehow survived. The absurdity of it hit him and he almost laughed, but the sound died in his throat when he looked at the foal. The little spotted horse was nursing from the mare now, its tail switching contentedly, already bonding with its new mother. It looked happy, safe, exactly where it belonged. And yet Jack felt a sharp pain in his chest watching it, a sense of loss that surprised him with its intensity. He'd known the foal for less than a day. It shouldn't matter this much. He'd rescued it, kept it alive, and now it had a family again. This was the best possible outcome, so why did it feel like someone was tearing out a piece of his heart? Jack backed away further, putting more distance between himself and the herd. The stallion watched him go, but made no move to pursue. The message was clear. The human had done his part, and now it was time to leave. The wild belonged to the wild, and Jack belonged somewhere else. He walked away slowly, fighting the urge to look back. Every step felt heavy, weighted with a grief he didn't fully understand. It was just a horse, he told himself. Just an animal he'd helped for a short time. It didn't mean anything, but that was a lie, and he knew it. In those brief hours with the foal, Jack had felt something he'd thought was lost forever: purpose, connection. The simple joy of caring for another living thing without violence or destruction involved. For the first time since coming home from the war, he'd felt like himself again. Like the person he'd been before the military, before the trauma, before everything went wrong. When he was far enough away that the horses were just dark shapes against the desert landscape, Jack finally let himself stop and look back. The herd was moving away, heading toward whatever grazing grounds they called home. The foal was in the middle of the group now, protected by the bodies of the other horses, the mare staying close beside it. They would take care of it, Jack told himself. It would grow up wild and free, running across the desert with the wind in its mane, living the life it was meant to live. That was better than anything he could have given it. Jack turned back toward Silver Ridge and kept walking. His water bottle was almost empty again, and his stomach was growling. He'd given the last of his food to the foal last night, which meant he needed to reach town soon or face some hungry days ahead. The sun was past its peak now, starting its descent toward the western horizon. If he pushed hard, he could probably make it to Silver Ridge by nightfall. There was a church there that sometimes let homeless people sleep in the yard, and a diner that occasionally gave away day-old bread. It wasn't much, but it was survival. The miles passed slowly, each one identical to the last. Red dirt, sparse vegetation, endless sky. Jack's thoughts drifted as he walked, moving between past and present without clear boundaries. He thought about the war, about the men in his unit who hadn't made it home, about his ex-wife who'd tried to help him but finally given up when he couldn't stop drinking, couldn't hold a job, couldn't be the husband she needed, about his parents who'd died thinking their son was a hero, without knowing he'd become a broken man living on the streets. He thought about the foal, too, more than he wanted to. Wondered if it was okay, if the herd was treating it well, if it would remember the human who'd saved it. Probably not. Animals didn't have memories like people did, but maybe somewhere in its horse brain there would be a trace of those hours they'd spent together. A shadow of comfort, a sense that not all humans were threats. Jack hoped so. He hoped he'd given it something good to carry forward into its wild life. As the sun touched the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Jack saw lights ahead. Silver Ridge, such as it was. A scatter of buildings along a two-lane highway, gas station signs glowing against the gathering darkness. Civilization, or at least the bare bones of it. Jack felt his steps slow as he approached. He'd been avoiding places like this for months, preferring the isolation of the desert to the complicated messiness of being around other people, but tonight he was too tired to care. Tonight he just needed water and a place to rest. The gas station was busy, trucks pulled up to the pumps, people going in and out of the convenience store. Jack walked past it toward the residential area beyond, looking for the church. He found it on a side street, a small white building with a faded sign that said, "All are welcome." Jack had learned that churches didn't always mean those words, but he was too exhausted to look for alternatives. He walked around to the back where there was a small yard with some trees, found a spot that was out of sight from the street, and dropped his backpack. The ground was hard, but he'd slept on worse. Jack pulled out his thin sleeping bag and laid it out, then sat down with his back against a tree trunk. His whole body ached, muscles protesting after the long walk and the confrontation with the stallion. He should eat something, but he had nothing left except some salt packets he'd saved from a fast food restaurant weeks ago. Those would have to wait until morning, when maybe he could beg for some food. Jack closed his eyes and tried to settle into sleep, but his mind wouldn't quiet down. He kept seeing the foal's spotted coat, kept hearing its small whinnies, kept feeling the warmth of it pressed against his side during the night. He'd done the right thing, letting it go back to the herd. He knew that. So why did it hurt so much? Morning came too early, announced by the sound of a lawnmower somewhere nearby and the smell of coffee drifting from houses across the street. Jack sat up stiffly, his back protesting every movement. He'd slept badly, waking repeatedly from dreams about horses and dust and battles that mixed memory with imagination until he couldn't tell what was real anymore. His mouth was dry as sand and his stomach felt hollow. He needed water first, then food, then to figure out what came next. He rolled up his sleeping bag and stuffed it into his backpack, trying to look purposeful, like someone who belonged here. That was the trick to surviving on the streets, looking like you had somewhere to be, some reason for existing in a space. If you looked lost or homeless, people called the cops. Jack had learned to move through the world invisibly, just another face in the crowd, nobody worth noticing or remembering. He walked around to the front of the church where there was a water spigot and drank deeply, refilling his bottle until it overflowed. The main street of Silver Ridge was just waking up when Jack walked through. A few early risers heading to work, a postal truck making its rounds, the gas station already busy with the breakfast crowd. Jack's stomach growled at the smell of food coming from the diner next to the gas station. He had no money, but maybe they'd let him wash dishes in exchange for a meal. It was worth asking. The worst they could say was no, and he'd heard no plenty of times before. The diner was called Rita's Place, a small establishment with faded red vinyl booths and a counter with chrome stools. Through the window, Jack could see it was about half full, locals mostly, people who probably came here every morning for coffee and gossip. He hesitated at the door, suddenly aware of how he must look. He'd washed his face at the church spigot, but his clothes were dusty, his beard was unkempt, and he probably smelled like someone who'd spent the last 2 days walking through the desert. But hunger won out over pride. Jack pushed open the door and went inside. The conversations didn't exactly stop, but they quieted, heads turning to look at the stranger. Jack was used to that reaction. He kept his eyes down and walked to the counter, sliding onto a stool at the far end. A woman in her 50s with iron-gray hair and kind eyes approached him. Her name tag said Rita, and Jack guessed this was her place. She didn't smile, but she didn't frown either, just looked at him with the kind of assessment that came from years of dealing with all kinds of people. "What can I get you?" she said. Her voice was neutral, giving nothing away. Jack cleared his throat. "I don't have money," he admitted, the words tasting like shame. "But I can work for a meal, wash dishes, clean, whatever you need. I'm a hard worker, I promise." Rita studied him for a long moment, and Jack waited for the rejection. He could see her weighing options, calculating risk. A homeless veteran asking for handouts. It was a story she'd probably heard before, maybe believed, maybe not. But then something shifted in her expression. "You look like you could use some breakfast," she said finally. "How about you eat first, and we'll talk about the work after?" Jack's throat tightened. Kindness was harder to take than rejection. He nodded, not trusting his voice. Rita turned and called out an order to the kitchen, then poured him a cup of coffee without asking. The coffee was hot and strong, and tasted better than anything Jack had drunk in months. He wrapped both hands around the mug, letting the warmth seep into his fingers. The breakfast arrived quickly. Eggs, bacon, toast, hash browns, more food than Jack had seen on one plate in a very long time. He tried to eat slowly, to have some dignity, but hunger won, and he found himself shoveling food into his mouth like a starving man, which he supposed he was. Rita didn't comment, just refilled his coffee and left him alone. Around him, the other customers had gone back to their conversations, the stranger already forgotten or at least ignored. When Jack finally pushed back the empty plate, he felt almost human again. Rita came over with a pot of coffee for a refill. "That work offer still stand?" Jack asked. Rita considered him again, and Jack saw something in her eyes that might have been understanding, "My morning dishwasher called in sick," she said. "If you can handle a few hours, I'll pay you cash. Nothing fancy, just minimum wage, but it's honest work." Jack felt something loosen in his chest. Honest work. When was the last time someone had offered him that? He spent the next 4 hours in the kitchen, washing dishes in scalding water, scrubbing pots, wiping down counters. His hands got wrinkled and red, but he didn't care. It felt good to be doing something useful, to be contributing instead of just taking. The cook, a large man named Danny, didn't talk much, but he wasn't unfriendly. He showed Jack where things went and then left him alone to work. It was exactly what Jack needed. Simple tasks that kept his hands busy and his mind quiet. During a slow period, Rita came into the kitchen and leaned against the counter. "You do good work," she observed. Jack shrugged. "I appreciate the chance," he said. Rita nodded. "You passing through or planning to stick around?" she asked. The question caught Jack off guard. He hadn't thought beyond the next meal, the next day, hadn't planned anything because planning required hope, and he'd run out of that a long time ago. But now, standing in this kitchen with his hands wrinkled from dishwater and the smell of honest work in his nose, he felt something stir. Maybe not hope, not yet, but possibility. "I don't know," Jack said honestly. "I've been on the road for a while. Not sure I know how to stop anymore." Rita poured herself a cup of coffee and settled onto a stool, clearly in no hurry. "Everyone knows how to stop," she said. "Question is whether you want to." Jack didn't have an answer for that, so he just kept scrubbing the pot in his hands until it gleamed. Rita watched him work for a moment before speaking again. "I could use someone reliable," she said. "Morning dishwasher, maybe some prep work. Nothing glamorous, but it's steady. There's a room above the garage out back. Hasn't been used in years, but it's weatherproof. Needs cleaning, but you could stay there if you wanted." Jack's hands stilled in the soapy water. She was offering him more than a job. She was offering him a chance to stop running, to have a place, to rebuild something resembling a normal life. Part of him wanted to say yes immediately, to grab onto this lifeline before it disappeared. But another part, the part that had learned not to trust good things because they always ended badly, held him back. "Why would you do that?" he asked. "You don't know anything about me." Rita smiled slightly. "I know you're honest enough to ask for work instead of just begging. I know you do a good job even when no one's watching, and I know that look in your eyes. You're military, aren't you? Combat vet?" Jack nodded slowly. "Army, 3 tours in Afghanistan. Got out 6 years ago, been having a hard time adjusting." Rita's expression softened. "My son served too," she said quietly. "Marines. He didn't make it home. So when I see someone who did make it home but is struggling, I figure helping them is one way to honor his memory." Jack felt his eyes burn and blinked hard. "I'm sorry about your son," he managed. Rita nodded her thanks. "Think about the offer," she said, standing up. "You don't have to decide today, but the job's yours if you want it." For the rest of his shift, Jack couldn't stop thinking about Rita's proposal. A room, a job, a reason to stay in one place. It terrified him as much as it tempted him. He'd gotten used to the freedom of the road, the simplicity of only having to worry about himself. Staying meant responsibility, meant showing up every day, meant the possibility of failing again and disappointing someone who'd taken a chance on him. But it also meant having something to build on, a foundation instead of just endless drifting. When his shift ended, Rita paid him in cash, 2 20s and a 10. Jack stared at the bills in his hand, more money than he'd held in weeks. "Thank you," he said, and meant it for more than just the money. Rita pointed to the door at the back of the kitchen. "Garage is out there if you want to look at the room. No pressure. Just thought you might like to see what you'd be getting into." Jack nodded and walked outside, following a worn path through a small yard to a detached garage. There was an external staircase leading to a door on the second floor. The room was small and dusty, with a single window that looked out over the desert. There was a bed frame with no mattress, a small table, and a bathroom so tiny Jack could barely turn around in it. But the walls were solid, the roof didn't leak, and there was electricity. After 2 years of sleeping on the ground or in shelters, it looked like luxury. Jack stood at the window, looking out at the vast expanse of desert beyond the town. Somewhere out there was the foal, running wild with its new herd, living the life it was meant to live. Jack was about to leave when he heard voices from the yard below. He looked down and saw Rita talking to a man in a sheriff's uniform. Their conversation drifted up through the open window. "More attacks on the wild horses," the sheriff was saying. "Bureau of Land Management says they're going to do a roundup, remove the whole herd." Rita sounded distressed. "But where will they take them?" "Most will go to holding facilities," the sheriff replied. "Some might get adopted, but the older ones, the Stallions, they usually end up being put down. Can't be trained, too wild." Jack's heart started pounding. They were talking about the herd, his herd, the foal's herd. He rushed down the stairs and out into the yard. "Excuse me," he called out. The sheriff and Rita turned to look at him. "What's this about a roundup?" The sheriff sized him up, taking in Jack's appearance and clearly categorizing him as someone not worth much time. "Wild horse herd about 30 miles west," he said shortly. "Been causing problems, getting into ranch land, competing with cattle for grazing. BLM's coming in next week to clear them out." Jack felt something fierce rise up in his chest. That foal had survived being orphaned, nearly being trampled, the desert heat, and finally finding a new family. Now it was all going to be taken away because some bureaucrats decided the horses were inconvenient. No, Jack thought. Not again. He wasn't going to stand by and watch something innocent be destroyed, not when he could do something about it. The same instinct that had made him run into that fight between the Stallions came roaring back to life. "Is there any way to stop it?" Jack asked. The sheriff shook his head. "It's federal land, federal horses. Once BLM makes the call, that's it. Only way out is if someone with private land would take them, but that's a lot of horses to feed, not many people willing to do that." Jack looked at Rita, an idea forming. What if someone could find them a place? Would that work? The sheriff shrugged. "Theoretically, yes," the sheriff said. "If someone had enough land and was willing to take on the responsibility, BLM might allow a private adoption of the whole herd. But we're talking about a dozen horses, maybe more. That's a serious commitment. The land would need to be fenced, water source established, shelter provided. It's not cheap, and it's not easy." Jack's mind was already racing ahead, thinking through possibilities he had no business thinking through. He had no land, no money, no resources. But he'd also had no plan when he ran into that fight to save the foal, and somehow that had worked out. Over the next 3 days, Jack threw himself into the impossible task with a kind of determination that had gotten him through combat. He accepted Rita's offer of the room and the job, but every spare moment was spent researching wild horse adoptions, making phone calls from Rita's office phone, and talking to anyone in Silver Ridge who might have ideas. The locals were skeptical at first. A homeless veteran wanting to save a wild horse herd seemed like a pipe dream, the kind of crazy idea that went nowhere. But Jack was persistent, and his passion started to win people over. He learned that there was an old ranch about 40 miles out that had been abandoned for years, too remote for most people to bother with. The owner had died and the property was in some kind of legal limbo, with distant relatives who didn't want it but couldn't agree on selling it. Jack tracked down the lawyer handling the estate and made his pitch. "Let me use the land for the horses. I'll fix it up, maintain it, make it valuable again. In return, you tell BLM You've got someone willing to take the herd." The lawyer was intrigued but cautious. It took 2 more days of negotiations, but finally they reached an agreement. Jack could use the land temporarily, and if he could prove he could manage it, they'd work out something more permanent. The real miracle came from Silver Ridge itself. When word spread about what Jack was trying to do, people started showing up to help. The hardware store donated fencing materials. A local rancher offered to teach Jack about horse care and lend him equipment. Rita organized a fundraiser at the diner that brought in enough money for feed and supplies. Even the sheriff, who'd been skeptical at first, helped navigate the bureaucratic maze of BLM regulations. It turned out that people wanted to help, wanted to be part of something good. They just needed someone to organize it and give them a reason. Jack worked harder than he'd worked in years, driving out to the old ranch every day after his morning shift at the diner. He repaired fences under the brutal sun, cleared brush, fixed the ancient windmill that would pump water from the well. His hands blistered and his back ached, but it felt good. It felt purposeful. Every nail he hammered, every post he set, was for something that mattered, for the foal with the spotted coat, for the mare who'd adopted it, for the whole herd that deserved a chance to stay together, to stay wild, to stay alive. The day before the scheduled BLM roundup, Jack got the call. His petition had been approved. The herd could be relocated to the old ranch under his guardianship. He'd have to check in regularly with BLM, prove he was providing adequate care, but the horses were safe. They wouldn't be separated, wouldn't end up in holding pens or worse. Jack sat in Rita's office with the phone in his hand, barely able to process what had just happened. He'd done it, against all odds, with no resources except determination and the kindness of strangers. He'd actually done it. The roundup the next day was nothing like the brutal affair it could have been. Instead of being hauled away to holding facilities, the horses were carefully herded to trailers and transported to their new home. Jack rode along in one of the trucks, his heart pounding as they drove through the desert. When they arrived at the ranch and opened the trailer gates, he watched the horses pour out onto the land, snorting and kicking up dust, exploring their new territory. And there, in the middle of the herd, was the spotted foal. Bigger now than when he'd last seen it, but unmistakable. The foal looked at Jack across the distance and their eyes met. Jack couldn't know if the little horse remembered him, if animals kept those kinds of memories. But it didn't matter. What mattered was that it was alive, safe, running with its herd under the endless desert sky. The bay stallion, the fierce protector, led his family to the water trough that Jack had repaired. The adoptive mare stayed close to the foal, just as she had from the beginning. They were whole. They were together. They were free. Jack stood at the fence and watched until the sun began to set, painting the horses in golden light. Rita had driven out to see the moment, and she stood beside him in comfortable silence. "You did a good thing here," she said finally. Jack shook his head. "We did a good thing," he corrected. "I couldn't have done any of this alone." Rita smiled. "That's the point," she said. "None of us can do it alone. We need each other. The horses, you, me, this whole town. We're all connected." That night, back in his small room above the garage, Jack lay in his narrow bed and stared at the ceiling. For the first time in years, he felt something other than emptiness. He felt peace. He felt purpose. He felt like maybe, just maybe, he could build a life worth living. The nightmares would still come, he knew that. The past couldn't be erased. But now he had something to balance against the darkness. He had the horses depending on him. He had Rita and the people of Silver Ridge who'd given him a chance. He had a reason to wake up every morning, and somewhere out in the desert night, under a sky full of stars, a spotted foal slept safely with its herd, alive because one broken man had decided that saving something innocent mattered more than protecting himself. That was enough. That was everything.